Redditors who live extremely near to a time zone split. How does it affect your daily life? I commute to work across a time zone change. It's an hour drive, but basically it takes me 2 hours to get to work and 0 hours to get home. That's kind of crappy and kind of awesome. I actually work at the divide between Mountain and Central Time. It takes me an hour and 20 minutes to drive to work, and negative 50 minutes to get home. My county is on the Indiana-Illinois state line. My friend's phone would switch time zones from one side of his house to the other because of the different cell towers. He used a watch to keep track of Indiana time. My friend's phone would switch time zones from one side of his house to the other because of the different cell towers. That sounds neat and frustrating. I live in Nepal, and we are plus 5.45 GMT. All countries but Nepal are on either hour or half an hour difference from GMT, but not us. Nepal has to be different. It's a pain in the ass when calculating a time to Skype, just because you can't do the simple add on 6 hours or so it's add on 6 hours 45. I don't see why anyone thought it'd be a good idea to do time zones in partial hours. My uncle told me he has a watch with his work time zone and his phone is set to his house's time zone. Seems efficient enough. I feel like that'd be a great way to do it. I live on the border of AZ and NV. Half the year AZ is an hour ahead, but since I work for a company in AZ but live in NV I just stay on AZ time. AZ does not observe DST so I never have to change my clocks. I forgot how to set my watch. I love that we never change for DST. Try living in Lloydminster, Saskatchewan and Alberta, bang on the MST-CST dotted line. 23,000 people live in AB, 11,000 live in SK. Walk across 50 AB equals change time zone. I thought the whole city was under one time zone because of all the kids that bus in from out of town for school. But driving up 17 from Alcurve your phone changes from Alberta to Saskatchewan time like 5 times. I grew up in southeastern Indiana, back when Indiana never used daylight savings time, and it was a pain in the butt, and I think since Indiana never switched, it made it particularly frustrating, because for part of the year you were on the same time as everyone else, and then the rest of the year you weren't, and that change was harder on people than if you always knew there was time zone difference, because we were so close to the border of Ohio and Kentucky. And so many people commuted to work in those states because Cincinnati was right there. Most people actually observed daylight savings time unofficially. They set all their clocks at home to adjust to make it easier. But schools, most businesses, and some people still ran on Indiana's time. So you never knew who was on what time. So whenever you made plans or had a meeting or a party, you always had to specify which time you really meant, because people might be on a different time than you, and some of your friends or family possibly lived on a different time, and people still managed to frick it up frequently, getting to places an hour early, or an hour late. This was also before everyone had a cell phone, so double checking plans all the time wasn't always easy. I lived in Indiana for 10 years, and I found that to be worse than not following everyone else even though I find the LS to be idiotic and stupid. Not quite the exact issue but a kinda side issue. My girlfriend lives in a different time zone. We just specify the time zone when making any plans. It was an easily learned habit that sticks around. As a side note, in her language half 7 is 6.30. I'm English so half 7 is 7.30 so we also have to rule that we have to strictly use the form to match the language. Not rocket science, but it's harder than you'd think to always do it. So I lived in the Cook Islands for 2 years and 90% of the tourists there are from New Zealand. The two countries are on opposite sides of the dateline even though they're only an hour apart time-wise. Also, the majority of flights leave just before midnight or just after so many tourists would look at their tickets and arrive a day early or a day late at the airport. Also, you'd consistently lose a day depending on what way you were going. Once, my birthday was only 30 minutes long and spent entirely in the airport. Happy boarding. Finally an AskReddit thread that is relevant to me, and I'm 10 hours late. Anyway, for anyone left who might read this, I live in Central Time, USA, and work in Eastern Time. I have to be at work at 7:30 Eastern which is 6:30 my time, which kind of stinks. but I get off at 2:45 Eastern and I can make it home by 2:15 Central, so that part is pretty awesome. I live in a small town and work in a bigger town, so I also have to travel to the Eastern time zone if I want to go to the mall, the theaters, a nice restaurant, or anything else. It can get confusing but you get used to it. I live in New Zealand, so I'm in one of the counties that gets to see a new day first. +12, +13 daylight savings, GMT. Basically, we have Christmas and other event days early. Whenever my US friends are like Merry Christmas, I am like Happy Boxing Day. Besides that, my time zone makes it hard to watch live streams from the US and UK areas if you have to be going to work school. A 7 PM live stream in the UK is about 7 AM here. Depending on daylight saving it could be 6 AM or 8 AM too. So UK streams are the easiest to watch if you have nothing on in the day. Big event live streams, like E3, start at 3/4 AM, etc. Also, we get stuck in the late night internet a lot. US late night early morning mostly. Scary late night internet. We pick up my stepson over a time zone. They are an hour ahead of us. Once we learned to always use her time when arranging pickups and drop-offs it got a lot easier, but it still messes with us when trying to call him during the week. Slightly different. I live my life in normal time but my work life is all in Zulu time and on the Zulu day. So at 6 PM tonight it will be the 5th of July. Add to that I work a rotating shift. I'm going from a swing shift where I start at 9 PM and go to 5 AM. I arrive on the new Zulu day, tomorrow, and depart on the same day that has now caught up to the Zulu day. I used to live about 500 feet from the Mountain Central time zone. Businesses on either side would advertise hours in both time zones but didn't always specify. I got many places an hour late early. Also, you can hardly depend on your cell phone for time unless you manually set the time. If it was in both time zones surely you would know which was which, as one would say for example 2 till 7, 3 till 8, so you know that it opens at 3 in the time zone which is behind and 2 in the one ahead. It probably doesn't count, but I go to Auburn University which is a 15-minute drive, if that, to cross from Central to Eastern time. I live in Georgia when I'm not going to school, so I have to do a little coordinating with parents and friends and TV schedules and stuff like that. Just another small thing to think about, for the most part. The weirdest thing is how daylight seems different even though the times mean it shouldn't be. I swear it stays light in Georgia much longer than it does in Alabama. For some reason I have a hard time remembering the time difference. My boyfriend goes to Auburn and I go to Bama. We just moved to Atlanta for summer jobs and internships and I forget the time change every time I have to drive between the two states. It's almost fricked me up a few times. Don't live there, but have noticed at the western edge of the central time zone that daylight lasts until after 9 PM in midsummer. It's a little disgusting to be downtown, seeing people staggering out of bars after happy hour in broad daylight. You should try the bars in Reykjavik, 30 miles from the Arctic Circle, so it's pretty much like 24/7 for a period near the solstice. I live in American Samoa. We are in the last time zone on Earth, UTC 11. Independent Samoa is about 75 miles away from us. Both us and Samoa had been on the same side of the international date line. In December of 2011, Independent Samoa decided to change their side of the international date line. They skipped the 31st of December and went straight to the 1st of January 2012. Now, a 30-minute flight in a 12-seater plane means you travel in time by a day. During certain times of the year, Independent Samoa is a full 25 hours ahead of us even though we are geographically less than 100 miles away from one another. I live about 20 minutes from the central time zone. I am in Eastern. I used to work on the other side of the split. I got to work 15 minutes before I left. Took 2 hours to get home. LOL. One of the best things about growing up in a rural town on the border of Mountain and Central Time was the network stations. In the days before the internet and DVR, if you missed a show, or if two of your primetime shows came on at the same time on different networks, you were crap out of luck. We got the major networks feeds, ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, from both coasts, and thus prime times started at both 6 PM and 7 PM for us. I grew up in Indiana before they went with clock changing about 5 miles from the time zone line. My dad worked across the line. Half the year it was the same time, half the year we were an hour ahead. Now we're always an hour ahead. The best part was New Year's when my dad would take me time traveling between the time zones on a county road that was split down the middle, or so he claimed. A guy I know's house is on the border between 2 states. He says the only way it affects him is that he has to walk all the way to Virginia to take a pee. Late, but I live on the western tip of Texas, Mountain Time, and my university is in Central Texas, Central Time. Driving back home for breaks gets really spooky because if you leave any time after 9 or 10 AM it gets dark towards the end of the trip. The sun sets as you roll through endless flat desert. Darkness falls as you wind around the mountains and hills. There are no towns to name. Maybe some lights in the distance. Maybe a truck ahead or behind. You had to have traveled an hour, you think, but you check the time and no time has passed. You have entered the twilight zone. Be careful when visiting Holiday World in southern Indiana. I once stayed at a hotel that was a few minutes away from the park but in a different time zone. Ended up at the park an hour before they opened. I drive a truck for a living. We operate based on our home location time, but because our legal working day is dictated by ours, daylight savings time is a headache. Then if we cross into AZ on that day everything becomes clusterfucked. I used to live in Columbus, Georgia, about 100 feet from the Alabama line next to Phoenix City. It didn't affect my daily life because no one dares venture into Phoenix City, Alabama. I'm a little late, but when we go out to the bar while hunting, we stay there till 2. Then we go to the bar just across town and stay there till 2. Different rooms in my house would affect how my cell phone functioned because it would bounce off different towers. Back when long distance plans weren't awesome, I would get huge long distance charges just from walking from the living room to the kitchen. I would have to call and get them reversed every goddamned month. Now it's just the time setting. I can have it automatic because you never know what time zone you'll wake up in. To the OP, China only has one time zone. Geographically China is big enough for 5 time zones but they operate with only one time zone. Maybe Chinese living in the western part of China can answer this question better. Finally irrelevant. I live close enough to the Illinois-Indiana border I can walk there if I need to. I live near Sumner, Illinois and work in Vincennes, Indiana. Basically it's a lot of being early or late. Not much else except I am constantly asking your time, or my time, Illinois or Indiana time. Well, I also will make the drive to eat supper too, but often wind up jet in there and they're closed. Other than that there's no real difference. I live on a river separating GA from AL in the US. My place of work is in Alabama, but I live in Georgia. Because the city in GA is much bigger and much more popular in name than the misspelled, rather weird name of the Alabama town, most of the city and I'll just ignore the time change and keep things on EST instead of CST. The time officially changes in between the cities, but because they basically work as one big conglomerate, most businesses and households pretend the time changes just outside of city limits. I work in hospitality, so it's confusing for all the outsiders I have to explain it to, but within the city, it's pretty much just common knowledge and doesn't affect much except the official government buildings and banks, which most people just visit on the GA side anyway. Where I live in Alabama we actually use Eastern Time rather than Central. It is very confusing for other people because they assume that since we're in AL we're in Central Time. We always have issues with time, especially at work. A presenter will be scheduled for 9 and not show up until 10. This is a big deal when you have an entire school to deal with. I'm a teacher. It doesn't matter how many times we tell them we're Eastern. They are late 99% of the time. Not anymore, but as a kid living in rural Saskatchewan, we didn't change time, but a few nearby towns closer to the border did. They were close enough to the border to sync up with the closest major center that did change time. This meant that half of our hockey league would switch time zones after the season started. It was a constant question on whose time the game was played in, as it might mean leaving an hour early. Not a big deal, but as a kid I thought it was crazy. Living on the Indiana-Ohio border, Summer vacations kinda suck because the theme park was an hour ahead, so we had to wake up early if we wanted to have time to ride rides. If we left at 7 our time, we'd get there at 9 their time and only have a few hours left. I live in Singapore. A 30-minute boat trip to Indonesia would allow us to travel an hour into the future. It doesn't affect us. My story is less interesting than most. My so works in Japan, which is only 3 hours behind most of the year, 4 hours behind during daylight saving summer. I was excited for DLS to end, but then I was told I would have to start opening at work, so I would have to go to bed early. He would usually attempt to call me just as he finishes work, 8 PM there, 10 here. By 10 I should already be showered and ready for bed, so I have to tell him no. It's pretty lame, but I will see him in September. And then be together at Christmas with no more distance. I live in Indiana and we are so backwards that we get our own special time zone selection on any device that keeps track of the time. Arizona here. Welcome to the party. I live 15-20 minutes from the state border and I used to feel so sly when I bought my first cell phone. In '03, many years ago, when I first moved to the Midwest. I used to live literally on the border and my phone WLD jump ahead an hour, but I was still central, so I was such a badass making unlimited NW calls at 8 PM instead of 9 PM. TL. Dr. NDT was calling me a badass for my cell phone life hack. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.